So here we are with the Battle of Britain. Half of Europe is in Hitler's hands already, and now he turns his eyes on the British Isles. He plans on invading Britain with what he calls Operation Sea Lion. But first he must send his air force to soften up the ground and to gain air superiority in order to support this invasion. If the British Royal Air Force is in control of the air and the Luftwaffe cannot take control of the air, no invasion can happen. So, the Battle of Britain is really completely a battle fought in the air. And because the British win the Battle of Britain, which is the first major victory in this war against Hitler, Hitler is not able to implement his plan of Operation Sea Lion. So it's a very important conflict here, and it lasts from July 10th through October 31st of 1940, the actual Battle of Britain. So we're talking about a handful of pilots on both sides, German and Britain, who are every day practically fighting day and night missions, fighting during the day, bombing at night, and basically having to go round the clock, getting planes shot down. The life expectancy of a pilot was extremely short, and as Winston Churchill, who now becomes the Prime Minister and takes over after Chamberlain, as Winston Churchill said after the Battle of Britain, never have so many owed so much to so few. So who are the so many? The so many is the entire British Commonwealth Empire, have owed so much, in other words, their salvation, because there was not an invasion of England by Hitler, to so few. And who were those so few? Well, they were the pilots. The pilots who completely fought the war in the air. So Churchill is an incredible figure, very important for Britain at this time. He has an indomitable will, a invincible courage, and he has no intention of giving in to Hitler whatsoever. He will not let Britain fail. He will not give up the fight. And his courage and his determination are very significant for the English people at this time. Not only were they fighting in the air, as I had mentioned, but they were also bombing, and oftentimes bombing at night. First, the Germans bombed London. Some people say that it was a mistake, the first bombing, but the Royal Air Force, the RAF, retaliated immediately the next night by bombing Berlin. And so this set off a series of almost nightly, what they call blitz, of civilian cities on both parts. So almost every night for a period of time, London was being bombed. It was basically to destroy the morale of the civilians, and as well the other bombings were targeted on military targets or infrastructure, but it was also to beat down the morale of the people. By the end of October of 1940, Hitler finally decides to call off the invasion of Britain, and the English win the Battle of Britain, essentially. One of the big aids for the British, one of their big advantages, which helps them throughout the war, was radar, which they had developed quickly, the capacity to foresee these raids and these attacks by the Luftwaffe because they've picked them up on the radar. And with the help of the Poles, who had already been studying the German codes, they were able to break the code of the Germans for all of their operations, and this intelligence operation, which was run at Benchley Park, a little bit outside of London, was called Ultra because it was ultra top secret. And these code breakers were able to use the same machines that the Germans used. They captured some machines and they figured them out, like I say, with a great help from the Poles. The two main machines that were being used were the Enigma and the Tunny machines. And so they were able to know about all of the movements and the German orders that were being passed between German intelligence and German military officials. It was extremely important that this capacity to read their messages remain a secret, and so Churchill made sure that no messages that were received um, were obviously being communicated through their secret messages and could not have been known in another way. So they didn't act always on all of the intelligence that they received in order to maintain the secrecy of this capacity. Another important aspect of the British defenses was the auxiliary units that Churchill established and the guerrilla warfare units. Another name for it is his secret army, the Special Operations Executives, the SOEs, which he declared had to set Europe ablaze. They were essentially agents, men and women, normal, everyday civilians, who were trained, especially in many different intelligence skills, and were sent out in all of Europe to work with resistance groups and to carry out acts of sabotage and assassinations and espionage, mostly in the French resistance, but also in many other parts of Europe. And they would make small attacks on German outposts, or they would set explosives to infrastructure or oil reserves, etc., to disrupt the whole um, military machinery of the German army. They were very effective, and essentially some historians claim that they might have actually shortened the war by as much as 6 months with all of their activity, which was especially important for the later invasion of France by the Allies at D-Day. They played an especially important role. Now we need to mention briefly Italy's military exploits. Mussolini wanted to expand the presence of Italy in the world and take over a control of the Mediterranean Sea and of all the territories that surrounded the Mediterranean Sea. Essentially, he had dreams of restoring the old Roman Empire, and he set his eyes on North Africa. Italy was already present there in Libya since 1912, and he wanted to move into Egypt and essentially take over a very key position of the Suez Canal, which was being defended at the time by the British. So he goes across from Libya into Egypt and attacks the Brits at the Suez Canal, and he's quickly pushed back into Libya. And actually, the advancing British troops carry themselves all the way halfway through Libya, and essentially Mussolini has to call on Hitler to help him out, and eventually Hitler sends German forces to maintain the Axis presence in Africa. Otherwise, they would have been completely pushed out. Then Italy decides later that same year to invade Greece. And so they come in through Albania, and they want to also invade Yugoslavia. but the Greeks quickly pushed them back into Albania, and again Mussolini has to ask for the help of Hitler. So Hitler has to sacrifice some of his important military units that he was going to be using here with the Russians, or the Soviets, and he has to help out his ally Mussolini, and so he sends Germans down through Yugoslavia and into Greece and eventually to Crete, pushing the Allies to Crete. So now Germany is in Yugoslavia and Greece thanks to Italy. But the next campaign on Germany's list is a very ambitious campaign. It's called Operation Barbarossa, and it is Hitler's dream to invade and conquer the Soviet Union. Now, Stalin did not foresee this in any way, shape, or form. Remember, Hitler and Stalin had signed an agreement that they would basically carve up Eastern Europe and divide it amongst the two countries, between the two countries. So he's not expecting this at all. And in June 22nd of 1941, Hitler launches an attack on the Soviet Union, which is actually the greatest invasion as far as space and numbers are concerned in human history. So it's the largest military operation with regard to manpower and casualties. He sends in over 3 million German soldiers, 150 divisions, 3,000 tanks, plow into the Soviet territory. Because the Soviets were not expecting this invasion, and because of those purges of the military hierarchy that Stalin had done during his first years in power, the Soviet military was not prepared for this invasion and essentially was not able to hold back Hitler and the German troops. They did their famous blitzkrieg and plowed through all the way to Moscow. And you can see on the map on the right, there is a dotted line that goes right next to Moscow, and that is the furthest advancement of the British army, or the German army in the invasion of the Soviet Union. What eventually comes to the aid of the Soviets was the same thing that came to the aid of the Russians when Napoleon tried to invade Russia in 1812, and that would be the winter. So the Soviets, the Russians, know how to fight in winter. They have equipment that can fight in winter. They are able to move in winter, whereas all the invading armies that ever tried to invade the Soviet Union are not prepared for winter. It's a lesson that maybe at some point somebody should learn. But anyway, Hitler obviously had not read his history books about Napoleon and thought he was somehow better than Napoleon, and he turned out to be just as bad, if not worse. And slowly the Soviets pushed back the German army and counterattacked and ended up taking hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, and those that they didn't take prisoner died of cold, of hunger, of disease, etc. So eventually, with the fall, or with the failure of the Battle of Stalingrad, Hitler will be completely defeated on the Soviet front. But the important part about this operation and the failure of this operation was that Nazi Germany now had to fight a two-front war. If he had kept the Soviet Union as his friend on the eastern side, he would have been able to concentrate all of his forces on the western side. But now Germans are all over the place. They're spread so thin, and now he's facing a formidable foe like the Soviet Union that although they were not winning in the beginning, they have immense resources, both natural resources and manpower. He totally underestimated the enemy against which he was fighting, and this will prove to be crucial in his downfall. So, we've talked about the military advancements, but I want to also touch upon this terrible part of World War II, the history of World War II, and that would be the persecution of the Jews. In the 1930s in Germany, things were already starting to get difficult for the Jewish people. Essentially, the Germans, through their laws and practices, were trying to discourage the Jews from remaining in Germany. They wanted them to move out. They persecuted them by not allowing them their property rights. They couldn't hold offices, etc. In 1935, they end up passing the Nuremberg Laws, which strips even the Jews of their citizenship, forbade intermarriage, etc. The Jews, as a people, had been very influential, especially in culture and politics and industry. They ended up winning 24% of Germany's Nobel Prizes, while they were only 0.8% of the population. So they excelled in pretty much everything that they did. But there was a very anti-Jewish policy throughout Germany, and this only got worse with the rise to power of Hitler. Then, on Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, in November of 1938, violence broke out in all of Germany, with synagogues being burned and Jewish shops being destroyed, and hundreds of Jews were killed, and thousands others were arrested. Then things just slowly got worse. It was an incremental advancement of anti-Jewish sentiment and anti-Jewish laws and actions against the Jewish people. It didn't all happen overnight. And it was very difficult for the Jews to get out of Germany by this point. It was difficult for them to get out of Europe or out of German-occupied territory, because you might be able to leave Germany, but Germany occupied now most of Europe, so or German allies, right? So where to go and how to get out of the situation? The Allied countries weren't exactly interested in receiving Jews either, and refugees. America itself had very strict limitations on immigration. Remember what time we are here in America. We're talking about the 1930s. We're in the middle of our Great Depression. So America is not enthusiastic about accepting lots of refugees. Remember, we've got a whole workforce that's not working. We've got unemployment that's so high. We don't want poor people coming right now into our country. There's no jobs that we can give them. We can't find enough jobs for ourselves. So there's a very anti-immigration policy, and it's not that the doors are completely closed, but there are great limits and quotas that are put on each of the countries, and it doesn't matter whether they're refugees from a difficult situation. And many people did not understand either the degree of the difficulty. They did not understand the degree of this persecution. But even people that lived there at the time, even the Germans themselves or even the Jews themselves, did not foresee how quickly and how terrible it was going to get for them. So it was hard to understand the whole picture and foresee how things were going to play out in such a very short period of time. So these anti-Jewish, laws have passed. This violence against Jews has broken out, and now the Gestapo start rounding up thousands of Jews and forcing them into the ghettos or taking them away to concentration camps. But a lot of people didn't even know what concentration camps really were at the time. So in these places, they either died of starvation, of cold, or of disease, and many were simply executed. Then, in September of 1941, all the Jews were required to wear a yellow star. So now they are marked as being Jews. And we know that in June of 1941, the Germans began experimenting with mass killing methods in the concentration of Auschwitz in Poland. In that August, the SS placed a huge order for a pesticide, Zyklon B, with a German pest control firm. And this was the indicator of what would then become known as the Holocaust. I thought it important to insert this slide in this context. Pope Pius XII was the Pope during the Second World War. He is often vilified and accused of not having done enough to save the Jews, and for having made a concord with Hitler, and for not having publicly condemned Hitler or Nazism or the genocide of the Jews, etc. I want you to have a correct perspective. All of the information that I've taken here is just little tiny pieces, um, little evidences, and I've gotten them from a Jewish source in order to be more impartial. Because if I were to get them from the Vatican website, maybe maybe it wouldn't exactly be a good proof, right? Testimonial for yourself is always the best testimonial. So I actually got them from Jewish sources, and many of the Jews at the time of World War II uh, were the greatest defenders of Pope Pius XII, and even the Jews today, many of them recognize the truth behind what is being said of Pius XII. So on the last slide of this slideshow, where I usually leave your homework, I have also left two links that are links to the Jewish library, where there's a whole series of articles written by Jews about the Vatican, Pope Pius XII, and his role in the Holocaust and the fight for the Jews, to save the Jews. And it's really worth reading at least some of the articles, or at least one of the articles, because it's important that we, as Roman Catholics, or in a general study of history, that we know the truth behind these false accusations. So, what are some of the points that I've brought out here and put here? So, at the beginning, when the Netherlands were invaded by Hitler, he started rounding up Jews, etc. And immediately the Dutch bishops in Holland condemned these actions by the Nazis. Right after their condemnation, all priests, monks, and nuns with any Jewish blood were sent to concentration camps. This included Saint Edithstein, Santa Teresa Benedetta della Croce, who was a Carmelite nun. She was also of Jewish heritage and a convert. So she was rounded up with everyone else, and she ended up dying at Auschwitz. So this was just one small example of when the religious leaders spoke up against an obviously immoral action on the part of the Nazis, the reaction of retaliation on their part. So, the second point I mentioned is survivors of the Holocaust themselves testify that none of us wanted the Pope to take an open stand. We were all fugitives, and fugitives do not wish to be pointed at. The Gestapo would have become more excited and would have intensified its inquisitions. If the Pope had protested, Rome would have become the center of attention. It was better that the Pope said nothing. We all shared this opinion at the time, and this is still our conviction today. Nobody questioned at that time. Nobody questioned what the Pope really thought about Hitler and about the persecution of the Jews. No one. It was clear the Church's stance, and in every occupied country, the bishops in one way or the other, or the Vatican themselves directly, intervened and protested. Not always with a public, proclamation, but in every single country there were these protests. In 1940, Pius XII did send out a secret letter to all his bishops, Opere Caritate, by work and love. And he quotes Pius XI's encyclical Mit brennender Sorge, with burning sorrow, which condemned the Nazi doctrines. And he ordered in this letter to his bishops that all people suffering from racial discrimination at the hands of the Nazis were to be given help. He sent out an order to religious buildings to give refuge to Jews, even at the risk of their own lives. And he released monasteries and convents from the cloister rule so that they could be used as hiding places. Just to give you a personal example of this, in our own convent, we accepted in our convent Jews, and the women were given religious habits. So they said that all religious could only have one habit, and that the other habit had to be given to a refugee of some sort. So any women refugees were made into madri, if you will. The children were incorporated into the school, so they were given uniforms and they were just slipped into the classrooms where there were so many children that you wouldn't be able to distinguish one from the other. And the men were either given clerics, in other words, they were dressed up as priests, or they were given jobs such as gardeners or plumbers or electricians that worked in the house and made repairs or did the gardening. So they were incorporated into the monastery and convent life, and they were hidden in these convents and monasteries throughout Europe. Pope Pius XII declared to his papal nuncio, "We are not concerned about our image. Above all else comes the saving of human lives." So his priority was not what did it appear, what was the reputation of the Vatican. Anybody, including Hitler, the Nazis, the Allies, the Jews themselves, everyone knew the real stance of Pope Pius XII and the Vatican, without question. The Polish Cardinal, Prince Sapieha, who is actually the father figure, spiritual father of Pope John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, when he was a seminarian in Poland at this time. So he begs Pius XII not to make public protests, as they only increase the persecution of his people. So this is the same thing as what happened with the Dutch bishops in Holland. When they did make an open public protest, it only increased persecution and made it worse for the Christian people, and as well as the Jews. The Pope supervised the receipt and disposition of funds sent in his care by Jews from all over the world, receiving some 2 billion lire from Jews in the United States alone by the end of 1945. So the Jews themselves knew that the most effective way to get help, to get money to help and sustain other Jews, was to go through the Vatican. That was the most effective organization to help save Jews in all of Europe. The Vatican oversaw what became known as Operation Baptism, which was the creation, the falsification of baptismal certificates for thousands of Jews to help them escape occupied countries. So the churches, which it was a very important, baptismal certificates are very important documents, especially at this time. They basically would oftentimes take the place of a birth certificate. Remember, the churches themselves were the keepers of all legal documents, really, and so birth certificates, wedding certificates, confirmation certificates, death certificates were all kept by the churches. And so these were very important documents. They were identity documents, and they would have proclaimed the person to be a Roman Catholic, and that would allow them to pass through and be undetected as Jews. So the church was fabricating all over Europe birth certificates, and the population of the Roman Catholic Church boomed in this time period. After the war, and this is a personal testimony of two rabbis, after the war, the chief rabbi of Israel thanked Pius XII for what he had done, whereas the chief rabbi of Rome went even one step further, and he converted to Catholicism and took the name Eugenio, which was the baptismal name of Pius XII. Jewish writers and Israeli archivists have established that the Pope supervised a Vatican rescue network which directly saved 860,000 Jewish lives, more than all the international agencies put together. And again, I repeat, this comes from Jewish sources, not from the Vatican, not from Catholic supporters. It's important to know the truth of history, and you, especially as Catholics, need to know the truth about Pope Pius XII and the Jews. So what is this Holocaust? This was what the Nazis, what the SS, what Hitler called the final solution. The final solution to what problem? The Jewish problem. So in late 1941, the Gestapo start taking the Jews from the ghettos, especially the ghettos in Warsaw in Poland, to concentration camps, where the strong would work. They would be lent out sometimes to industries, making war materials, and those who were sick and weak and old, and the women and the children, etc., were usually eliminated immediately. The first mass gassings that we know of began in the camp of Belzec near Lublin in March of 1942. And then a number of other mass killing centers were developed. The most well-known of all is Auschwitz-Birkenau. In 1943, we know that Mengele, who worked in Auschwitz, began working on experiments on Jewish prisoners. He was nicknamed the Angel of Death. He would inject people with all sorts of chemicals to see the reaction. He would do experiments on retarded people, on people with abnormalities, and especially on twins to see what would happen. So he was doing medical and scientific experiments on live human beings and essentially atrocities. Towards the end of the war, the Germans started evacuating the camps. in to some degree, not to leave any evidence behind. They were trying to cover their tracks, and they were trying to move their prisoners, so they were moving many of the inmates um, to the further away from the front lines, and thousands and thousands died in these forced death marches, if you will. It's an estimate that about 6 million Jews were exterminated in the Holocaust, which is known by the Hebrews as the Shoah. They had developed, with their technology, a system in which they could kill quickly and efficiently huge populations, huge masses of people, and would then burn their remains in these huge ovens. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to concentration camps, or more precisely, if any of you have been to any extermination camps, because concentration camps were also for prisoners of war, and usually people would survive experiences at concentration camps. There was a higher level of survival. You could die of being shot on sight, or sickness, or cold, or starvation, but the chances of survival were higher than the extermination camps, which were camps dedicated to the mass killing of people in a quick, efficient, and horrible way. So this was the final solution for the problem of the Jewish people in Europe, to exterminate them all. And now we have another turning point in the war. First turning point was earlier in 1941. Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union, and that was a huge mistake, as we know, and he made many strategical errors in that invasion. But the second big turning point in the war will be the entrance of the United States. So how does America get to the war? We start off neutral. The United States is not ready to enter another world war. We had come out of the First World War. It had, seemed to be a worthless war, not worth fighting. Nothing had been gained, and basically the scene had been set for another world war. America did not want to get entangled again in these foreign affairs that didn't really affect her very much. She's so far away. She has oceans between us, right? Like the little joke up in the corner. What a lucky thing we've got separate beds. The separate beds, yeah, they're separated by a huge ocean. Like, leave us alone. You guys do your little thing over there. You fight it out, and we don't need to be involved. And so Congress ends up, starting in 1935, ends up passing a number of neutrality acts, basically prohibiting the export or the selling of arms, ammunition, and implements of war to any foreign nations at war. And then eventually it is also amended, and there's another act that's passed that specifies also that nations that are in civil war, because at this moment we also have Spain deep in their civil war, and we don't want to support either side of that either. We want to stay out of it all. So in general, the United States holds a position of isolationism. However, FDR, our old friend from the New Deal, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's still president, by the way, is in favor of internationalism. He believes that through open trade and open door policies, peace can be restored, and it's the best road towards an international international peaceful scene. This is not the opinion of the general American public, and he knows that. So he works slowly at um, changing the American mentality and preparing America for what he does foresee as being an inevitable consequence. He starts off by introducing a system of cash and carry. He, before, you know, the Neutrality Act completely prohibits any sort of sales, he allows the European nations to purchase materials, but they must agree to come pay cash. They can't buy on credit. They must pay cash, and they themselves must carry the materials back to their own countries. America didn't want to get sucked into a war by having their cargo ships sunk by the Germans, just like the ships had been sunk before World War I, and essentially the loss of American lives on ships ended up being one of the causes of America going to war. So we wanted to avoid that. So we started off with the cash and carry practice. Then Roosevelt came up with an ingenious idea after the Neutrality Acts had been passed to give old World War I destroyers to Great Britain in exchange for a 100-year lease on British bases in the Atlantic. And he got around the Neutrality Act because he basically said, well, look, I'm not really selling anything to these warring nations. It's an exchange. There's no sale going on. And the American people kind of accepted it. And the fact that they accepted this exchange and were not outraged was an indication that American mentality was starting to change and starting to lean in favor of Britain and the Allied forces. Then FDR goes one step further and he implements the Lend-Lease Act, which essentially, the laws had gotten a little bit more lenient, and he says, okay, I will lend you these materials, and you just give them back whenever you get the chance. um, he's trying to get around the laws any possible way. Then he declares, well, American trade is at risk and American lives on the ocean are at risk, so we need to declare not only the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Declaration, where, okay, European powers don't come into our hemisphere, but he extends that hemisphere idea to the ocean as well, and he creates what they call a hemispheric defense zone. In other words, you can't come into my waters, otherwise I'm going to defend my ships and any ships that come into my territory, which would include British ships as well. So there's a slow progression towards this friendly help towards the Allied powers. FDR is also intelligent because with these programs of lending and leasing and cashing and carrying and all that sort of stuff, he is slowly building up the arms industry in the United States. He's opening the door to defense production and government defense spending. So the mechanisms of the economy are already starting to gear up. So it was intelligent of him to have done these preparations, although it was not direct aid. He was preparing the United States to have at least its industry on its feet. Congress then, in September of 1940, passes a bill which initiates the first peacetime draft in American history. We realized that our military was dangerously weak. Let me give you a concrete example. Remember I said military spending had been cut back quite a lot during the Great Depression. At this point in American history, the American military was considered the 19th in the world, we in America were behind Belgium with regard to our military strength. That's pretty drastic. When you think about the size of America and you think about the size of Belgium, America was in a bad situation with regard to our military. So, putting into effect a peacetime draft and starting to build up our forces in the face of this international conflict, which was really absorbing the entire globe. When you think about all of Europe, Russia, North Africa, Asia with Japan, and all of the Pacific Islands, it was going to be very difficult for the United States to completely stay out of this conflict. And so it's a good idea to start building up a little bit our military and to not be so unprepared. Then the America begins to do naval patrols by American warships in the Atlantic to protect ships going back and forth to Great Britain. And finally, with regard to Japan, the U.S., in order to discourage Japan from more conquests in the Pacific, decided to place an embargo on Japan and therefore limit their access to natural resources that they needed for their military conquests. And then in 1941, in July, Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the U.S., which also hurt the Japanese greatly financially and economically. And then, similarly to what we were doing with Great Britain, the United States began also a Lend-Lease program with China, hoping to help China in their fight against the Japanese. So this American neutrality is something that slowly but surely starts to slip away and disintegrate and disappear. But it is not until the attack on Pearl Harbor that America is strongly and unitedly behind a war effort. And that brings us to Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was an important naval base near Honolulu, Hawaii, and it was attacked by surprise by the Japanese. Like I said when I was talking about the slide on Japan, they hoped to do a preemptive strike, a surprise strike, on the Americans, wiping out their naval presence in the Pacific to discourage the Americans from limiting their conquest in Asia and in the Pacific. And they hoped that they would cripple the United States so that we could not enter the war against them. That's exactly the opposite of what happened. This was the act, the single act, that united all of America against Japan, and then subsequently against Japan's allies, which would be Germany and Italy, and brought America with all of her might into World War II, with a determination to win this war at all costs. And the Japanese underestimated, too, the American will to see to the end, no matter what the cost, this horrible ordeal. And just some of the numbers, more than 2,400 Americans died in the attack on Pearl Harbor, and 300 planes were destroyed on the runways. There were sitting ducks. We're talking about an attack at 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning on December 7th in 1941. It was a Sunday morning. Nobody was up and around. Nearly 20 American naval vessels were sunk or badly damaged, and 8 battleships. So it was very crippling to the American Navy force in the Pacific. However, the American Air Force airplane carriers were not in Pearl Harbor at the time. so they were spared. They were out on an exercise outside of Hawaii, and they were not present. So our, carriers were safe, and that's the biggest force, especially now when we see that these battles are going to be fought predominantly in the air. And actually, a number of naval battles, they're considered naval battles, but they're fought between carriers and air their air support, their airplanes. So they're completely um, battles in the air fought by the Navy. And so the carriers are extremely important, and they were not destroyed. Immediately afterwards, FDR asks Congress to declare war on Japan. And afterwards, the Germany and Italy then declare war on the United States, and the United States enters the war on the side of the Allies. This obviously is the second most important turning point in the war, and with American presence, the Axis powers have no chance of overcoming um, the Allies. And that brings us to the end. I have included a time chart here of the period that we've covered in this slideshow. So it comes from the beginning of 1939 all the way up to Pearl Harbor in 1941 and the entrance of the United States into the war. And then we'll look at it. It kind of gives you a good summary so you can kind of fit in all the pieces together and see it laid out clearly. And then at the end, as I mentioned, I have the two episodes of World War II in color that I had wanted you to see. The Gathering Storm, which basically introduces us into the war and gets us going, and then the fifth episode was the entrance of the United States into the war, the bombing at Pearl Harbor, which was the most important episodes that have to do then with the United States. And then these two websites, it's the Jewish Virtual Library. One is a specific article, A Question of Judgment, Pius XII and the Jews, and then the other one is the index, if you will, of all of the articles about the Vatican and the Holocaust in the Jewish Virtual Library. So it's run by the Jewish organization in the United States, and that's why it's in English. And I think they're really good articles to clarify any controversial arguments over Pius XII. And I will leave you with that. So then we'll pick up with the Americans entering the war, and I will give you another short video to bring you up to Operation Overlord, which will be the presentation that James will give us, hopefully on Tuesday. So looking forward to that, and looking forward to seeing you, and then answering any of your questions. Goodbye, my dears.